I thought I'd put together a short introductory video that covers the next 3 weeks of text. We're going to be reading The Lottery, Orange World, Bog Girl, The Metamorphosis, The Old Man with Enormous Wings, and The Birthmark. And these represent a range of stories and a range of story types. I have no particular expertise in science fiction or fantasy fiction or horror. I don't read them. And so what I'm going to be talking about is mostly things that I've read recently as I've begun to put the finishing touches onto our course. You'll find that Orange World and Bog Girl are written by the same author, but I have them in different weeks. Uh, the Lottery is a Shirley Jackson story, a classic 1940s, late 1940s story that made quite a splash in the publishing world when it was first published. And it has remained a canonical work. It's one that is frequently taught in courses like this. The Metamorphosis, of course, you probably know already, even if you've never read it. It's the famous story of Gregor Samsa waking up one morning and finding out that he's been turned into a giant bug. The Old Man with Enormous Wings falls under the category of what's called magical realism by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And then The Birthmark takes us back to the 19th century, early 19th century American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne. So there's quite a range of stories and story types here. So I thought what this video might do is kind of put some categories out there and give you some ideas about how to think about these things. The gentleman on the right here, this is the famous American actor Vincent Price, who appeared in probably more cheesy horror and science fiction movies in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s than any other actor. He's one of the most interesting guys in the world to learn about. I thought it might help to make some distinctions between one type of fiction and another. When we're talking about fantasy, traditionally, fantasy fiction is something that looks back at the past. It's a time and place that we no longer live in. For those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, that would tend to fall into the category of fantasy. However, the Lord of the Rings stories, the plots, and indeed some of the settings come from Anglo-Saxon and Norse myth. Tolkien, the writer behind the Lord of the Rings trilogy, was an Anglo-Saxon scholar. He was an English professor. And most of the plot lines, most of the characters come in one way or another from Anglo-Saxon myth. If you've ever heard of the poem Beowulf, for instance, that is one of the great mythic stories that comes from Anglo-Saxon times and earlier. It's a hero story where a man goes out and has to wrestle with a monster and kill it, and then, oh, by the way, kill the monster's mother. But in our own time, when we read these tend to come across as fantasy books. There are other kinds of fantasy that might involve animals that can talk, for instance, and act like humans. We call this anthropomorphic. Another kind of fantasy might take place in made-up countries. Places that might look like something here on Earth, but in fact might not be. But anyway, fantasy tends to look backwards. Things tend to be simpler in fantasy in some ways. Relationships seem less complicated. Settings are created in a way that makes them perhaps look familiar in some ways, like a wood or a castle or a mansion or a hovel or a log cabin or a cave. But they're recognizable, but they're simplified in a sense. That's my take on what I've been reading about fantasy fiction. You may have more complex definitions than I do. Science fiction is kind of the opposite of this. This looks to the future. As a rule, science fiction tends to happen, dozens of years or centuries in the future. And we tend to look at them as places where technology becomes extraordinarily complex and either useful in one sense for humans, but malevolent in another. And science fiction can do things that both fantasy and horror cannot. And it can also do something that what you might call regular or conventional fiction does. And that is that it can offer us sort of alternative notions for the world that we live in now. A lot of science fiction is commentary on what's going on in our own society, issues of race relations, the possibilities of pandemic, which we're living through, the possibilities of technology, uh, the possibilities of war and destruction. Those are things that science fiction tends to project into the future in a way that allows them to comment on the present. And again, I don't read science fiction as a rule. I've read very little Arthur C. Clarke or any of those classic guys. Heinlein, for instance. I've read a little bit of those folks, but it's just not a genre that interests me all that much. But it does allow us kind of a way of thinking about the present sometimes. And there's a very famous story, of course, from Star Trek, the very first Star Trek, the 1960s television show that I watched obsessively for the only 2 years it was on. It got canceled. There was a very famous scene in there where Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, who you now see in these awful commercials, kisses Lieutenant Uhura, literally an African woman who's an officer on the ship. And it's the first interracial kiss that was ever shown on television. And the only way they could get away with it, it could get through the network censors in those days in the 60s, which were much more strict than they are now, was saying, oh, this is in the future. This is millennia away from our own time. And so they said, oh, well, that's okay because it's made up. This would never happen in real life. Interestingly enough, that kiss occurred around the same time as the famous Loving versus Virginia case, the case that overturned various state laws that said that black people and white people could not marry each other. So there you go. The last category here is horror, and I do not read horror at all. I've started a couple of Stephen King books, and I just don't like them. I'm not a horror movie fan, so I don't tend to watch them. But what's interesting about horror is, of course, they're designed to frighten us. And what that allows us is really something kind of interesting because it allows us to look at ideas that we might otherwise suppress or avoid. It gives us a place to kind of speculate about human conduct in a way where rules are not quite as important as they are now. As the slide says, sometimes horror can be purgative in the sense that it lets us have a significant emotional experience solely to come out on the other side feeling better. Okay, to say, oh boy, well, at least I'm not doing that, or that hasn't happened to me. What's interesting about this is that this kind of purgation, what Aristotle calls catharsis, we find in tragedy too. The notion where we see something terrible happen on a stage or in a film or in a text, like or the stories we're reading, and we go, oh my God. And it just cleans us out emotionally. And we're kind of in a state where we can suddenly deal with the world around us in a more sophisticated, more rational kind of way, because we're able to have our emotions literally purged and kind of cleaned up. And so we tend to become more rational at the end of that process. I should mention, by the way, that fantasy and science fiction and horror always kind of intermingle. And there's no clear-cut boundaries that says, oh, if it's X, Y, and Z, it's fantasy. If it's, ABC, it's science fiction. And if it's DEF, it's horror. All of these kind of cross each other's boundaries. There is pure forms of all these, but at the same time, all of these stories are anchored in human experience. So human experience is infinitely variable. And so the settings, the plots, the characters, the incidents are going to be fundamentally things that human beings would encounter. But the settings, the context in which these occur, the consequences for actions might be also a little different based on the setting. But don't worry if you can't identify something specifically as one kind of story or another. In fact, almost all the stories that we're dealing with are sort of boundary shattering in one way or another. As I said, we have 6 stories. This is not in the order that we're reading them, but they're kind of in the order that I'm thinking about them. The Lottery is one of my favorites, and that's one that we're actually going to be reading first. This is the famous Shirley Jackson story. As I said, it takes place in a fictional New England village where once a year everybody participates in a lottery where one person is chosen to be stoned to death. And everybody participates. Everybody is a potential victim of this, and everybody gets a vote unless they're too young to pull a little piece of paper out of a bag, and then their father or the husband does it. Another story we're going to be reading that the same week that we're reading Bog Girl. And Bog Girl is a Karen Russell story. It's not in our textbook. It's one that I've linked from the New Yorker. And it's about sort of an island near Ireland where they're in a bog. They're draining a bog, getting the water out of an area that's kind of like a swamp. And they come across the body of a woman that's perfectly preserved, but she's 2,000 years old, and she comes to life. I don't know if that would be fantasy, science fiction, or horror, or some mixture of all three. And in that story, a boy takes her home and makes her his girlfriend, and she goes to high school with him. And it's a fascinating story about these kinds of boundaries that are crossed in that particular kind of relationship. The next two stories we deal with are classical stories. They're both in our textbook, Old Man with Enormous Wings and The Metamorphosis, are stories that have been read for decades. The Metamorphosis is probably the most famous horror story about waking up and suddenly realizing you're a cockroach. Well, what would that be like? What would it be like to live in a family, in an apartment with a family, and you're this big bug? And you're almost the same size you were before. You're just turned into an insect. And I have a separate video about that that's posted for that week. The other story, The Old Man with Enormous Wings, is what's called magic realism. It is a story about an angel falling to earth. And in a sense, it's a retelling of the Metamorphosis, is that one person is turned into something else. And what exactly does that mean? And then that's a story that actually relies on another story that we're not reading, a very famous Russian story called The Grand Inquisitor, about what would happen if Jesus comes back to earth. And in the story, Jesus comes back to earth in the middle of the Spanish Inquisition and in the 15th century. And in that story, which is another sort of example of maybe fantasy, the idea of Jesus coming back to earth might be a fantasy of some sort for some people. For other people, it's a dead certainty, although it hasn't happened yet. Well, what if he comes back? And what happens in the story is that the Grand Inquisitor, who's like the head torturer, the head judge of these Inquisition trials, says, "We don't need you. You're not, we've gotten past you." And it makes for a very uncomfortable story about this notion of, if salvation shows up, what would it look like? How would we know that salvation is at hand? And that's what the Old Man with Enormous Wings asks as a question, as does, of course, the Dostoevsky story. So that's the second group of stories. The last one is Orange World and The Birthmark, and they are very different. Orange World is written by Karen Russell. This is who Karen Russell is, by the way, who also wrote Bog Girl. This is about a woman who just has a baby, and this devil shows up and says, "You have to feed me. You have to breastfeed me, or your baby's going to die." And so you could decide if that's fantasy or horror. My sense is it's more on the horror end of things. But she has to deal with this in a really interesting kind of way that I think will surprise you. Russell is a very original writer. She does things in fiction that nobody else has ever done in terms of plot, and I think you'll find it a fascinating story. The Birthmark is one that will be the last story in the third week of these 3 weeks. Nathaniel Hawthorne writes it in the 19th century. A man who's this extraordinarily knowledgeable, powerful scientist marries this gorgeous woman, and she has this tiny defect, a little tiny birthmark, and he decides that he wants to fix it. Okay, and she has to decide whether she's going to do that. It fits into this category of stories because it's sort of like science fiction in the sense that technology and knowledge, human knowledge, allows the scientist to be in a position to think he can make this correction. some people might see it as a horror story, but it's also a story of a marriage, and we certainly have seen enough of those in this course. I'm going to talk about two other aspects of these kinds of fiction, power and religion. And power is one that's really kind of interesting. The notion that fantasy has something to do with presenting alternatives to existing power structures, to disrupting our notions of how power is disseminated, how it's used, how it comes into existence, how we respond to it. And so it might offer us, perhaps in a simplified form, different alternatives for the society in which we live. Science fiction, as I've said, some people argue is one that lets us see possibilities in our own time that might affect how the future works out. I mean, there's a lot of science fiction that's dystopic. You know, the world is in existence in the story after some big war or a pandemic or some natural disaster. And those are certainly things that we live with in our own time. If you think about wildfires in California or hurricanes in the Gulf states, or you think about the pandemic and you think, is this the new normal or is this the future? What is it going to be like if more and more people get sick? I mean, like, is this going to be like the Black Plague in the 13th, 14th centuries in Europe? We just don't know. And so science fiction can be a way of kind of showing what the various possibilities are of the future that might happen. Another take on this in terms of power is that it shows sort of political or scientific or technical values and constraints that we live with. And then we sort of say, well, what would happen if we got rid of some of those? Or what if we violated those in some way? Who has power and who doesn't in that context? And of course, you know, all kinds of post-apocalyptic films and television shows that explore those kinds of questions. Like there's a silly Kevin Costner movie called The Postman, where there's a post-apocalyptic society and he becomes an authority figure because he has a mailbag. And he has that because it has the symbol of a government that doesn't exist. People say, well, maybe he's supposed to be in charge. There's a show on public television right now that runs on Sundays called Chaos about what happens if there's a natural disaster in Britain that knocks out part of the power grid. And, you know, who takes charge in that kind of environment? Is it the people or is it the elected leaders? Is it the police? Is it the army? Is it civil authority or is it a whole bunch of rebels? I mean, and so they're kind of exploring in our own time as if this thing happened like this week. It's fascinating. Okay. And then another sense of this is a personal one. With horror, we might be confronting things that scare us silly. And if we can confront those fears and kind of see them played out in front of us, we can assert control over them. And we can ourselves establish a certain power relationship over those. We can kind of take charge of our fears and maybe we can deal with them more accurately. And that's another power that horror has, I think, is to let us, as I said earlier, purge ourselves, to get things out of our system, or to suddenly say, well, maybe that won't be as bad as I think it will be. I mean, and you can imagine your own demons. I think the things that you're scared of, the things that you find horrifying, you know, maybe after watching a movie or reading a story, you can say, well, I won't be as bad as this guy, or that won't happen. And so then you might be able to deal with your own fears in a more rational way. I have no idea if any of this is true, but these are some of the things that commentators on this kind of fiction have talked about. Religion is the last thing that I want to talk about here. And of course, there are movies like The Exorcist, which is actually based on a true story here that happened here in St. Louis in 1947. I don't know if you knew that or not. It's a specifically religious film. In the stories that we're reading, as I said before, The Old Man with the Enormous Wings is a story that's specifically religious. It has a priest in it. The figure looks like an angel. In fact, it might remind some of you of this awful John Travolta movie from the 90s called Michael, where he's an angel that comes back to Earth and he drinks and he smokes and his wings are always shedding feathers and stuff. It's an odd film. Don't ask me why I saw it. I've already talked about the fact that Old Man with Enormous Wings in part relies on this notion of the Grand Inquisitor, this Dostoevsky story about Jesus coming back to Earth. The The lottery is interesting because in that story, there's no authority figures at all. The guy who runs the lottery is the coal merchant. He owns the store that does the coal stuff, and he organizes various town activities. There's no sheriff, there's no marshal, there's no mayor, there's no police force, and most importantly, there's no church. And if you think of, classic New England villages, the first thing that has that will stick in our heads is a white clapboard congregational church. That's kind of the epitome of New England architecture for many of us. And of course, you can find small towns here in Missouri where the major building is a Catholic or a Lutheran church. If you go down to Zell, for instance, if you go down 55 away, you'll notice that the major building in Zell is a large Catholic church that's been there for over 100 years. But this village doesn't have one. And so there's basically no authority figures at all. And there's no religious figures. There's no one in that story that has the moral weight that we assign to religious figures. Okay. If we look at other stories, if we look at Orange World, The Metamorphosis, Bog Girl, there's no religious figures in there either. And so you have to kind of wonder if that lack is something that's significant. You have to kind of figure out if the devil figure, which is really kind of a low rent Satan-y figure in Orange World, whether that's real, whether it's made up, and how scary it really is. I mean, the women in the story respond to it in different ways. So you might want to think about that. And many times when we think of devils, we think, oh, that's the opposite of an angel. Okay, and of course, some of you have read that Dan Brown book, Angels and Demons. But in this case, we have to kind of wonder what exactly is the character of this particular demon. Is it Satan? Is it sent by Satan? Or is it sent by somebody else? Something that we always forget is that demons, Satan-like figures, are not specifically always Christian. They could be pagan, and they could come from a different kind of religious background, a religious environment, so that we don't always think of a devil figure in literature necessarily as coming from a Christian one. It's like not all these stories are retellings of Paradise Lost. But rather they're stories that explore our fears in some ways, and maybe we can sort of personify our fears by creating a devil-like figure. But again, because there's no other religious imagery in the story, the notion that somehow this could be a Christian figure or an anti-Christian figure, it seems to me to be kind of far-fetched. But maybe those of you who are more attuned to this sort of thing might be able to pick something up that I have not. I will mention one last thing about the lottery. The thing that we don't know is why exactly the people in the village do this. And that, of course, is one of the great questions behind the story. There is this notion that comes from the Old Testament that actually is also common in other religions that come from the Middle East, like Christianity and Judaism do, and Islam does, where there's this idea of a scapegoat, where a tribe or a village gets together and lays all of the sins of the village onto one person and then sends that person out to die in some kind of ritualized fashion. Either the selection of the person is ritualized or the death is ritualized. In this particular story, both of those happen. But in fact, if you go to Leviticus, the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament, you'll see a description of a scapegoat and how it's done back then. It's a small reference, but it still gives us this idea that this tribal society that's prevalent in the Old Testament is one that relies very heavily on this idea of collective sin and collective forgiveness, in the sense by punishing one person. And of course, for those of you who are Christians, you know that that's fundamentally the story of Jesus, that he was sent to redeem sin among all human beings, and that he died redeeming the sins of all of us. And so even that sort of scapegoat idea might underlie a part of the lottery. However, like Orange World, there's no religious imagery in the story itself. So you have to kind of decide, is the lack of religious imagery, is the lack of religious structures or figures or references, does that indicate something? And that's kind of where I'd like to end. I would tell you that almost every kind of critical school, sociological, mythological, gender, you name it, historical criticism, can find itself somewhere in these kinds of stories in fantasy, horror, and science fiction. Just because these things happen in alternative worlds or environments that are unfamiliar to us doesn't mean that they're not approachable in the same way that any other work of fiction is. You've got plot, you've got character, you've got setting, you've got all the same elements, they just show up in different ways. So one of the keys to remember as you're looking at these stories is that you treat these like stories. You treat these like the texts that are not in the science fiction or horror or fantasy category, because we can use the same tools to explore them. Well, I've taken up enough of your time. I hope you find this useful. I can't wait to see what you folks say here in this last third of the course. Thank you.